So these are going to be the best decks after the surprise hotfix nerfs, and the first one, which is leading the pack by a pretty decent amount, is Deathrattle Rogue. This deck really only loses to hard aggro, and even then, if you're able to reduce the cost of a Burning Blade Acolyte with the Scourge Illusionist and double activate its Deathrattle with the Snowfall Graveyard, it can pretty easily build a wall that an aggro deck can't really get through. The deck for the most part revolves around this card right here, Scourge Illusionist, which is a 4 or less cost Deathrattle minion, which means you will always get it off of the sketchy information. It is the only one that is 4 or less. It'll then reduce the cost of a Burning Blade Acolyte, Infectious Ghoul, or Invincible, which can get you multiple minions on board or make your minions that are already on the board significantly stronger. You have other ways of getting these death rattles as well, with the Snowfall Graveyard to double activate things, the Forsaken Lieutenant, and Shatter Shambler to just immediately activate the death rattle. And mulligans for this deck are pretty simple. They're just going to be the Shambler, the Forsaken Lieutenant, Snowfall Graveyard, and sketchy information. The next deck on the list is going to be Imp Warlock, which, surprise, surprise, uses no new cards. It is just the same Imp Warlock in the past because it is actually able to take down this Deathrattle Rogue. It is so fast and it can escalate so quickly that most decks that are combo or even control based can't deal with this. It is unreal how strong this deck is. Its win rate is actually slightly higher than the Deathrattle Rogue. I just think that Deathrattle Rogue, if played perfectly, is theoretically better. But if you're a new player or you played this deck in the past, you already know how to play it, this deck is going to absolutely smash the competition. It has like a 57% win rate from Diamond through Legend. It destroys everything. Mulligans are just going to be things like Fiendish Circle, Via Library, 1 cost Imp Generators, and then you can also keep King Reform, especially on the coin, so you have a really, really good turn 5 play to just dominate the board. The next deck on this list is going to be Pure Paladin. There are 2 ways to build it. I will put one of them in the description. I like Pure Dude Paladin the most because you're able to utilize the Dunboulder's Bridge really effectively. You can summon a ton of Silverhand Recruits. They all become 3/3s. You can give a ton of your Silverhand Recruits Taunt, which can help against the aggro decks, which are pretty prevalent right now, as well as Miracle Rogue. They might have to kill one of your minions with their big weapon, and that could actually be the difference between winning and losing a game. And then that doesn't even include the fact that your late game with the Countess is just nuts. You're able to get 3 really big legendary minions. Those are oftentimes able to get pumped up with the Dunboulder's Bridge. So if you can get Alakir, if you can get King Crush, Lady Steno, or a couple of other cards that either have Rush or Charge, all of a sudden the Countess becomes even better. And then you also have some pretty good early tempo with a lot of 1, 2, and 3 drops, as well as 4 drops. So you're really not falling behind aggro decks like Imp Warlock either. Next on the list is Curse Implock, another deck that runs no new cards, but it's just so strong from the last expansion that it's going to continue to dominate. You have the early game package of the Imps, like Imp Warlock, with the ability to kill your opponent over the top with the curses. I think that in the current meta, Imp Warlock is better because the control is just not there right now. The people aren't able to deal with wide boards, and since games are ending really quickly because of Rogue and other aggro decks, the curses aren't able to build up. So if the meta slows down, if some things get nerfed and the game length goes up by a turn or 2, control starts seeing more play, all of a sudden this already good deck will become a lot better because your curses will have that little bit of extra time in order to do more damage. Instead of getting to about 3, 4, 5 damage, you'll get 5, 6, 7 damage, and that is enough to close out most games. The next deck on the list is going to be Blessed Priest, and this deck is interesting because it uses only 1 new card, Animate Dead, but it is so strong. So ideally, turn 2 or 3, you will play Radiant Elemental along with maybe a Thrive or something, and then what is your opponent supposed to do? Leave it up? No, they're going to kill it, which means later on, you're able to play a 1-cost Radiant Elemental, which is a spell that helps progress the Priestess as well as Handmaiden. And then from there, you're able to combo off with a now 1-mana Radiant Elemental, play things like Boot of the Ascended, Powered Fortitude, Blessed to make some giant minions your opponent can't deal with. And then again, if you want to combo later on, you can play another Animate Dead or draw another Radiant Elemental and do the entire thing over again. And then in the very late game, Sunwell could potentially win you some games as well. The next deck on the list is going to be Big Spell Mage, which uses a couple of new cards in Astalar as well as the Arcane Defenders, but other than that is the same as before. The idea behind this deck is simple. You want to try to get one of your 3 now big spells, reduce their cost with the Barbaric Sorceress or Belinda Stonehearth, and then you want to reactivate them and scale up your hero power with Magister. That is your main go-to win condition. You actually can survive the game pretty well as well with things like Pelican Diver, and the Amplified Snow Flurry to slow down your opponent, Far Watch Post in order to reduce or increase the cost of your opponent's cards. The Deepwater Evoker can gain you a ton of armor, and then these taunt minions are enough to stop the Miracle Rogue from hitting you in the face with their weapon. So overall, this deck is just very good at dealing with a lot of the things in the meta right now, and I'm very excited to actually play this deck more because it was one of my favorite decks last expansion. Next on the list is Fel Demon Hunter. This deck is one that has been doing very well, especially with the Soul Eater's Scythe, which is able to actually dodge things like Patchwork, which is very prevalent in the meta right now because your minions aren't minions until you choose them to be. And the idea behind the deck is pretty simple. You run no minions, so you're able to get value out of cards like this Warband, as well as Mark of Scorn, as well as this card Deal with the Devil, which is basically a 9/9 lifesteal for 5 mana, which is just very good value. And then the idea is you want to OTK your opponent using Jace and reactivating all of your Fel spells, or playing the card right here, Silvermoon Arcanist, that gives you 2 spell damage, because the Fel Barrage, Mark of Scorn, and Unleashed Fel technically don't target your opponent. They just target at random or the board in general, which means you are able to still utilize the 2 damage without the downside of not being able to target your opponent. And the mulligans for this deck are simple. If it says Relic or Sigil, keep it. If it doesn't, send it away. The next deck on the list is Aggro Druid, which runs 1 new card, the Lingering Zombie. I'll get into that in a second, but you can potentially change this up and put more of an undead package in it if you want. Aggro Druid, it can be played in so many different ways, but this is the one that I think is the best because it's cheap, it's simple, and if you played it last season, it's still going to be very good. The, again, only new card is the Lingering Zombie, because you basically have to kill it 3 times for it to actually go away, which means it's a very sticky minion. So you're able to possibly have a target for Mark of the Wild, Herald of Nature, Pride's Fury, the Claw Fury Adepter, Sow the Soil, or anything you generate off of Plant of Evidence, because there's always going to be a minion on the board. Turn 1, turn 2, they're not going to be able to kill this card off 3 separate times, so you're always going to have that little bit of a spike of tempo that'll allow you to snowball out of control, because that's all that really needs to happen with Aggro Druid, right? If you're able to get a small board to stick and then pump it up turn 3, 4, or 5, the game will usually end by turn 6 or 7, and this card is very good at helping you do that. So the next deck on the list is Miracle Rogue, and there are a couple of different ways you can build this deck. You can run it with a couple more concoction cards. You could run it with the Wild Pawn Knoll and Maestra, because if you play Potion Belt, that counts as 3 other class cards, so Wild Pawn Knoll can be free as early as turn 2. You can also run this version, which I like the best, which has a couple more cheap spells and a couple of more cheap minions, so you can have really big pop-off turns. And I think those pop-off turns are going to win you games more consistently than an early Wild Pawn Knoll or 1 or 2 extra concoctions. So this is the iteration that I would recommend, and the goal is obviously you want to get as big of a stealth minion and or weapon out as soon as you can, because if you can get a 10 attack weapon out on turn 3 or 4, there's usually not much your opponent can do about it, and it just snowballs from there. I will admit this deck is hard to play and is kind of draw dependent, so if you don't get Draka or the Sinstone Graveyard at the beginning parts of the game, you might not necessarily win. The next deck on the list is Ramp Druid. I do think that after the Denathrius nerf, this deck did get a little bit worse. You're not able to OTK quite as soon, but you're still able to OTK with Astalar, Bran, the Anubricon, as well as Sire Denathrius. There's another version of this deck that is focused only on the OTK. It is 30 cards, and it ramps up very quickly and consistently, but I think this version just has a little bit of extra resources, so that way if you're playing against a matchup that might be more difficult, you have a couple more outs, right? Like in the other version, you might not run Sylvanas, but now you will run Sylvanas, so if your opponent plays a big minion, you have the means to kill it or potentially steal it for yourself. Overall, mulligans for this deck are just ramp and draw, basically Wild Heart Guff, Nourish, Seedsman, Wild Growth, Jerry Rig Carpenter, and if you're into aggro, you could probably keep the Plating and Planted Evidence as well to try to get some early resources. So the next deck on the list is going to be Beast Hunter, and Hunter is a class that got hit really hard with the Shock Spreader nerf. It used to be the 2nd overall class, now it is 9th. It dropped like 7 places in literally a singular day, but That being said, Beast Hunter is still super strong. It's got about a 53% win rate, and the only reason Hunter is as low as it is because people are still experimenting with Shockspitter Hunter, Arcane Hunter, as well as Quest Hunter. None of those decks are as good as Beast Hunter, though. Beast Hunter is an interesting deck because due to its curve and the fact that it has really good early, mid, and late game, there is never going to be a meta this deck is not good into. It might not necessarily be insane, but it will be good in every meta. If you need to go against something aggressive and the meta is really fast, you might be able to take out a couple of slow cards like Insatiable Devourer or maybe Sylvanas and put in some extra 1-drops for more early game. If you're playing against some more slow control-based matchups, then you can shift in a Lorthamar instead of one of your 2 or 3 drops, and all of a sudden you have another big win condition that can help close out games into more control matchups. Just imagine having a double-statted King Crush do 16 damage on turn 9. So at the end of the day, this is just a really, really well-rounded deck that I think is very hard to fall out of the meta, and because of that, it's a pretty safe craft, although extremely expensive. So last but certainly not least is going to be Triple Blood Death Knight, and honestly, this deck is really strong for 3 main reasons. 1, disruption. You have Far Watch Post, you have Blade Master Okani, you have Sylvanas to steal a minion, Theatar, Mutanus, and Patchwork, which disrupt combo decks. So Ramp Druid, if you're able to get some of these disrupt cards, might not be able to pull off its combo as consistently. You have insane removal and healing, so any aggro deck or bursty deck, even like Miracle Rogue, probably won't have the damage to kill you after you play Vampiric Blood, as well as gain a ton of HP off of a Death Strike. And then the last thing is the fact you have 12 different Discover cards, which means you're going to have this constant flow of new cards in your hand. It's going to be very flexible, and you're able to discover cards from outside of your pool. So even though you're running 3 Blood Runes, you can still discover a card like Defrost to get a little bit of extra draw, which can be very, very good. Not to mention the fact that Death Knight has some of the best individual spells in the entire game. All that being said, this deck turns into a really good deck that has a couple of cool win conditions as well, with Alexandros and Lorthamar for big minions and winning in attrition, so it does have its fair share of actual win conditions, and it becomes, in my opinion, one of the best decks in the game.